Was the New Testament written in 320 AD at the Council of Nicea? Or do we have evidence for something else? Thank you for joining me for another Christian investigation where we are going to go deep into this question of when was the New Testament written, evidence for should we trust it or not. The first 5 books of the New Testament are all about historical recounting of events that happened. Think with me for a second. If you were writing a history about, say, New York City, and you were writing it today, and it was covering from the creation of New York City all the way through to today, would you mention the World Trade Centers and what happened in 9/11? Of course you would. This would be a key moment in your historical recordings. Well, we have an event just like that happened in 70 AD. And actually, you need to backtrack a little bit before 70 AD to 67 AD, where the Roman general Titus, he put a siege around Jerusalem for 3 years, where they had no food. They were dying. This was terrible stuff. And eventually, at the end of 3 years, in 70 AD, he sacked Jerusalem. He took it over. Well, this is very interesting when we start looking at the New Testament. We see these historical recordings about the Judeo-Christian faith, and it doesn't mention this incredibly pivotal event where Jerusalem, the city of the center of their whole religion, was defeated. What does that mean? What does that tell us for internal evidence? That tells us that the New Testament was written, at least the first 5 books, were written before 70 AD, and quite literally before 67 AD. Now, when we start digging deeper into this, we see certain books were obviously written. They weren't all written at 67 AD. They were written, some of them were written before. The Gospel of Mark has evidence that points to it being written around 50 AD. The book of 1 Corinthians, written maybe a year or two later, 52, 53 AD. So when we start to get to these dates, can a book be written today about the events that happened at the World Trade Center? It's 20 plus years since the bombing. Could a book be written today that actually shows more evidence and is more truthful than a book that was written 2 weeks after the event? Yeah, it could, because you've been able to compile all of the data, all of the evidence. This is exactly what the Gospel of Luke did. The author, he said, I started interviewing people. I compiled all of this evidence and I'm presenting it to you. He was writing to his friend, probably a former employer, and he was writing to him to give him evidence to what had happened. So when we start to get to these earlier dates, this 53 AD type of a date for the writing, then we start to look even deeper. This book, 1 Corinthians, that I'm talking about there, Paul actually describes this creed. So we got to understand, people in that day, most of them did not read and write. So how would you remember events that happened if you couldn't watch a podcast on it? What would you do? Well, you would recite the events that happened in a rhythmic form. It was called a creed, where they would say, these are the things that happened. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul actually gives us one of these creeds. So this book, probably written around 53 AD. That is roughly 20 years after Jesus died on that cross. And he says, I was given this information at an earlier date. Probably this information was written down weeks or at most months after Jesus died. And it says that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. that he was buried, and that he rose again 3 days later, according to the scriptures. These were things that they memorized, they remembered. These are events they did not want to forget. He goes on to say that this event was seen, that Jesus showed himself to 500 people who were still alive at the writing of this letter. This is so early of a date. The New Testament was written, for the most part, at a very, very early time, recording events that they actually saw happen. They actually saw Jesus Christ go to the cross, to die on the cross. They actually saw him get buried, and then 3 days later come back to life, to present himself to over 500 of them, to show that this was the same person. He showed them the nail prints in his hands, the piercing in his side. He showed them, this is me. This is Jesus. Now it's your choice and my choice. With this early writing, do we trust what they wrote? Do we trust what they saw? This was a pivotal moment that changed all of history. I want to encourage you, do some research yourself to find out if Jesus Christ was who he said he was, and if he is and was, are you going to trust him and follow him? That's the question of today.